Hello, I'm Scott Stauffer, CEO of Scale Matters, and today we're going to run a little workshop style webinar, if you will, where we're going to share our approach to building comprehensive go-to-market growth models that serve as kind of the underlying foundation for our customers' annual operating plans. If you have questions along the way, feel free to put them in chat. First, a little bit about Scale Matters, and then we'll get into the meat of the show. We're a RevOps consulting business serving predominantly VC and PE backed growth stage and scale up stage businesses. What's kind of unique about our company is we take the traditional expertise around go to market tech that you would find in kind of all RevOps shops, but we marry that with expertise in FP&A and specifically go to market savvy FP&A. And this combined expertise lets us serve our customers with what we call a model first approach to RevOps. And what we've seen over the years is it tends to be very effective to drive substantial alignment across our customers' organizations. And the end result is they end up with faster and more efficient growth. Today, we're going to walk you through some of the modeling approaches we use so that you can put those approaches into play in your own organizations to hopefully achieve faster and more efficient growth. And though we're sharing, so to speak, our tips of the trade with you so you can do this yourselves, obviously, if you think you need some outside help, we'd be happy to talk with you about that. So, why have a workshop on building a better annual operating plan? Well, because most AOPs of growth and mid-market companies are dead in the water by the end of the first quarter each year. The folks at Scale Venture Partners look at this kind of stuff, and as you can see from this chart, over the last 3 years, more than half of companies are behind plan, even just after one quarter. And that's just terrible, right? And of course, misses on the top line are often correlated with even bigger misses in EBITDA because they're generally on plan with their expense budget. So they're kind of slow to react to missing revenue targets. We're going to talk a little bit today about why so many companies' AOPs have such a short shelf life, but mostly our goal is to share an approach that we've successfully used across countless of our customers to build detailed revenue plans, what we call growth models, that codify operating assumptions and they form a solid foundation for the broader AOP. Without these models, nobody has a deep enough understanding of how the go-to-market engine actually works. In other words, how growth is actually achieved. And without these models, you don't really have the ability to test different potential initiatives or investments to see what's going to have the most impact. And without these models, generally leadership teams are left powerless to have an adult conversation with their board around cause and effect and what it will actually take to achieve these goals. So, the annual operating plan has two primary components: the expense component, which we often call the budget, and the revenue component, which when done right is fed from the go-to-market plan or revenue plan or what we call the growth model. For most growth and mid-market B2B businesses, the comprehensiveness or the level of detail of the annual operating plan is kind of asymmetric between these two components, and I'll dig in here a little bit on what I'm talking. So the expense component lays out in detail exactly where money will be spent for each expense account or each department or cost center. This is a detailed spend plan. And then actual expenses tend to be tracked at that same level of detail to compare against budgeted expenses. Now, here's an example of a departmental expense budget where it identifies line item expenses for each employee, contractor, as well as non-talent expenses such as office supplies and rent and travel and software tools, etc. These budgets guide the functional leaders on exactly where and how they are expected to invest the company funds. By contrast, the revenue component is often just really a dissection of lofty annual goals into monthly or quarterly sub-goals, and then kind of an allocation or an assignment of those goals across different departments within the go-to-market function. It typically looks something like this. So we expect to leave this year at 23 million ARR. We're targeting leaving next year at 30 million ARR, which will kind of sustain our 30% plus growth targets. We're going to assume 105% net revenue retention, which means existing business should grow to about 24.2 million. That leaves a gap that has to be filled by new logo ARR of just under 6 million. Now, we know from kind of historical patterns, sort of how that will likely allocate across each quarter. And then we also take our 25% planned win rate, which requires pipeline coverage of 4x and 75-day sales time, and it ends up telling us what kind of pipeline needs to be generated each of these quarters. We know that we're assuming a little bit over half of that will be generated by marketing, about 40%, a little over 40% by sales, and partner will pick up the rest, initially around 6%, though it's expected to grow throughout the year. So this type of top-down revenue plan, it's not really a plan, right? It's basically breaking down goals. But it's insufficiently detailed to force and then codify operating assumptions around how the revenue is actually going to be achieved. For example, what are the marketing channels that will generate the pipeline? How much are we going to invest in those channels? What type of ROI do we need for each channel, and how does that compare to current performance? Consequently, we talked earlier about how many companies miss and how quickly. Well, the painful surprises we see are almost always on the revenue side, not the expense side. So we do see a number of companies claiming to do bottoms-up revenue plans, but 9 times out of 10, they're doing bottoms-up planning based on sales heads, on sales capacity, right? A sales capacity plan is what drives their revenue plan. Well, this might have been effective 20 years ago when most pipeline was generated by sales prospecting, but that sure isn't the case now. And sales head-driven plans are really just about useless in all but a very few businesses where sales prospecting is still the predominant top of funnel strategy. Sales capacity plans should be an output of modern growth models, not a driving input. So we're going to show you now kind of what it means to build a comprehensive growth model that your annual operating plan can stand on. So a growth model has two representations, at least in the way we go about them. A visual model, which is also known as a context model, and then a mathematical model. We're going to walk through each of these. And, I said at the beginning, it's a workshop style webinar, so we'll get into some amount of detail, but hopefully it will be valuable for you all. So the context model is basically a communications tool. In our case, it's a visual representation of how a business goes about achieving growth. And we build these visual models because they're a lot easier to absorb and understand than a traditional spreadsheet-based growth model. And that's because they provide more context, hence the term context model. So let's walk through an example. I'm going to hop out of the slide deck here and go to context model. We generally use Lucid to build these context models, but you could also use Miro or any other kind of visual process modeling tool, even PowerPoint, right? So the very first thing we're going to do is draw the core building blocks of the growth model. And we've already done that, so you won't have to endure me doing it in real time. So I'll just expose that here. And we're basically using the example of a fairly traditional SaaS business here. Everybody has a growth model, right? Which is kind of what are the components that happen that cause end of period results to be higher than the start of period results, right? This is an example of a SaaS or traditional subscription business growth model. Let me make it a little bit bigger. They have a starting ARR at the beginning of the period. That's reduced by some amount of churn and contraction, but then that gets moderated by some amount of expansion and upsell ARR. These first four, what we call change blocks, represent the dynamics that are happening to the ARR of the customer set you had at the beginning of the period. They work together to result in NRR, or net revenue retention. To the right of those kind of existing business change blocks is the ARR that comes from new logos added during the period. The sum of the starting ARR plus all of the change blocks equals the ending ARR, which hopefully is meaningfully higher than the starting ARR. Hence, we call this a growth model. And this is a very simple kind of ARR waterfall visual depiction of how the company goes about growing. Now, for each of these change blocks, right, churn, contraction, expansion, et cetera, there are one or more processes or motions, if you will, or playbooks, whatever you want to call it in your company, that are aimed at optimizing the change in ARR. In the cases of these red change blocks, we're executing processes to minimize the lost ARR. Maybe there's a training and onboarding process that hopefully increases adoption, which ultimately reduces churn, right? By contrast, in the green change blocks, we're on executing motions or processes that maximize the increased ARR. Maybe there's a very specific upsell motion to get a new product that the company has come out with cross-sold into your existing base. You'll notice in this visual here that each of these change blocks has a letter in parentheses. It corresponds to the tab down here with the relevant motion maps. Let me show you what one of those looks like. So we're going to go to the new logo motion map. And I know you probably can't read any of this, but on this tab, we've drawn the motion that supports new logo ARR acquisition for this customer. I'll make it a little bit bigger. On the left side, this is what you would basically consider to be top of funnel. In this case, they have an inbound top of funnel motion as well as an outbound or prospecting top of funnel motion. Now, these motions converge at the process stage they call first meeting scheduled, right here, which is kind of middle of funnel. Notice that each of these rectangles is a conversion process where there's some amount of fallout or leakage, like a funnel step. Each conversion process has an input and one or more success outputs and one or more failure outputs. These conversion processes chain together to form an entire go-to-market motion, right, that supports one of those change blocks in the ARR waterfall. Now, progressing through this particular motion from left to right, these guys have stages that represent first meeting scheduled, first meeting completed, discovery, proof of concept, procurement, commit, and then closed won. So if we just back out of this a little bit so we can see the whole thing, at this point, we sort of understand how many steps it takes to convert a prospect into a new customer. But other than the labels on the stages, we really don't know what they entail, who's responsible for them, et cetera. So we're still missing context. So this is where we add, in doing these context models, we add an annotation layer. And the annotation layer basically provides more descriptive context around each part of the motion. So again, I'll zoom in and let's take this first meeting scheduled stage. We now know that is the responsibility of the SDR team, and we only exit that stage when we have confirmed acceptance of a calendar invite from the prospect, or in the failure scenario, we lost the opportunity. And we do this annotation that for everything that's necessary to give the viewer clear context. By the way, one of the great things about this process of doing this work is the work that we do with our customers. Building out the annotation layer often exposes real misunderstandings within the customer of how their processes actually work. And this often becomes the genesis for some very constructive conversation to improve the process. So doing these context models tends to create alignment in and of itself and process improvement. But we still, so we have a better understanding now of sort of kind of who owns these things, what it means to move from one stage to another. But we still don't have enough context to build the math model, which is what CFOs need to actually put in the foundation for your AOP. So to do that, what we do is we add an instrumentation layer. So we'll expose that. And these blue boxes basically show us how do you measure this motion, what we call the instrumentation. For example, if we zoom in again on first meeting scheduled right in here, we now see that it is instrumented in the CRM in the opportunity object with record type equals new logo, and it relies on the stage and first meeting scheduled date fields. we see that the conversion step from first meeting scheduled to first meeting completed is clearly defined up here in terms of how conversion rate is measured and how cycle time is measured. Only by having the motion fully instrumented can you begin to collect the actual performance data that you're going to need to inform your forward-looking models. Remember, I mean, this is no different than weather forecasting. Models are a way to leverage historical experience to predict forward-looking outcomes. And as you could probably imagine, you might experience this yourself, many companies suffer on predictability because they really don't have great historical data. And that's generally because they've never done this work to define the instrumentation strategy necessary to properly measure their motions. Again, this process we go through, and I encourage you all to do this in your own shops, but it's paramount to driving the business requirements that will dictate how the CRM and other pieces of the go-to-market tech stack need to be set up in order to provide the data and analytics that you'll need to build your models. In other words, it provides the context, right? So this is, if you back out just on this new logo model, this is what a fully mapped visual context model of new logo acquisition looks like. Same thing with the renewal motion, same thing with the expansion motion. And then we simply layer those motions onto the base growth model. And this visual depiction then becomes sort of the North Star context for the whole organization to understand how their go-to-market engine actually works. In other words, how they go about the business of growth. The visual context model we just saw, again, it provides the foundation for building the math model. And this is the math model is where the leadership team is then going to align on assumptions and also do kind of scenario testing to help prioritize their forward-looking initiatives. So let's see how that works. So just like in the context model, the math model comprises a series of conversion processes as well. Context model, we had them kind of going left to right to show a motion. Math model, they tend to go up and down. And typically we have the math model mirror the visual context model. In this case, this math model template I'm using is not tied to the context model I just showed you, but you'll still get the general idea of it. So if we first focus on new logo acquisition, we can see that the motion is represented by 4 different types of metrics. These volume metrics, let me make this bigger. These volume metrics are indicated by the pound sign. So total meetings set, total meetings held, number of pipeline opportunities, number of closed won deals. Those are volume metrics. Conversion rate metrics are indicated by the percent sign, and then cycle time is indicated by the delta sign. And then down here on the bottom, you can see there's also some currency metrics indicated by the dollar sign. Now, you'll notice here that we're looking, at least on an aggregate basis, at a very simple process with just 3 conversion points. Meetings set to meetings held to pipeline opportunities, and pipeline opportunities to close one deal. Now, if I jump back just for a second to this, the new logo model, the context model, and get rid of the instrumentation and annotation layers, you'll notice that these guys have, like 4 or so top of funnel steps, conversion steps, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like 6 bottom of funnel. So it's probably more granular than what their mathematical model is. And part of the reason for that, I apologize, is that because they just don't have the historical data often. So that when companies first start doing this, they're building their models, like their context models, in terms of what their processes is and what they want them to be. But their actual historical data is not usually well populated. So they end up building their first mathematical models at a level of granularity that's not as robust as the visual context models. And that's fine, because what will happen is this time next year, because you've done the context model, you will fix your instrumentation and you'll have much more granular historical data. So the first thing you do with these models is you populate with the historical data. So you see here, month minus 15, that's 15 months ago, 14 months ago. We've populated all of their historical data. In these companies' example, While they don't have a lot of granular data, they have tagged it all based on their sourcing strategy. So they happen to have two different marketing investment strategies to drive top of funnel, paid search and organic. They also do AE prospecting, and they have a partner program. So they do have a reasonable amount of historical data for each of these sourcing strategies. So again, the first thing you do is populate with historical data. How much time you need to populate, whether it's 15 months or 3 months or 6 months, it sort of depends. If your business doesn't have any seasonality, you probably can get away with the last 3 to 6 months of data. If it does have seasonality across the year, you probably want to go to about 15 months of data. So again, step one, populate with historical data. Step two, we have this assumptions tab. By the way, all of these templates, this one, the rep capacity model I'm going to show you, the visual context model, we're happy to share that stuff because the whole point is to help companies do this themselves if they want to. So we next go to this assumptions tab, and in columns D and E, what we're doing is making summary representations of that historical data. In this case, what we're looking at in column D is the trailing 12-month average of the historical data. And then in E is the trailing 3-month average of the historical data. The next thing we want to do is we want to say, okay, based on the historical data, what is going to be our baseline for the forward-looking months? So, and in our case, we basically take next 3 months at a time. So N3M is next 3 months. We've chosen to have the next 3-month baseline be identical to what the trailing 3-month average is. So you can see in this case, we've populated the baselines metrics with what the most recent 3 months actual experience has been. Then in this template, these next 4 columns, H through K, this is where you start to make your assumptions about how these baselines are going to change. What would drive change? Maybe overall market conditions, increased competition. More than likely, what you're going to make assumptions is that you're going to get better at stuff. You're either going to invest more money. Maybe you're going to, right here, we have the investment in media spend going up 10% a quarter for 2 quarters. But maybe you're going to improve your win rate, right? So here we say the conversion from meetings held to pipeline opportunities, while it's starting at 73%, we believe because of some things we're doing for training our sales team, et cetera, that we're going to improve that by 0.5% each quarter. So you capture your assumptions. Very important that you document them. And you can document them either by putting a comment in this cell or in this template. We have a bunch of columns to document why you made the adjustments to the baseline that you decided to make. So after you've done this work around agreeing on your assumptions, and this is a very important part of getting alignment across your whole go-to-market organization, then this model automatically populates the forward-looking data. So if we go out here to column S, month 1, month plus 1, month plus 2, that's the next 3 months, right? So the model populates itself based on the historical data and the work you do to decide what your assumptions should be. The next thing, so if we go down to the bottom here, which is the aggregate, for this particular company, we can see that they're basically, the model's predicting that they'll need, they'll do roughly 9 deals a month, increasing a little bit, but kind of 8.5, working its way up to 9. So the next thing we then do is the rep capacity model. And remember at the beginning of this session, I said way too many companies think rep capacity model is what drives revenue, and it isn't. The only time rep capacity model drives revenue is if all of the pipeline is generated by sales reps prospecting. Very few companies have that anymore, right? The vast majority of pipeline is generated through partners and through marketing and community and all this other stuff. So sales rep capacity is now a derived number. It's not a driving input number. So anyway, we have this model that we have shared many times and happy to share again. But basically, the way it works is it takes the historical conversion rate, stage to stage conversion rate. It also understands, because this is what we gather through interviews, is time spent in stage. So in stage one, how many hours does a salesperson spend per prospect on stage one activities and so on. And I'm not going to explain in detail the way this model works. There's a video if you want it, you can click on and it'll explain the whole thing. But the end result is the model basically says a fully ramped rep at this particular company can close about 42 deals in a year, right? So that's 3.5 deals a month. So if we go back to the growth model here, and we know these guys need roughly 9 deals a month, it says that they need to sort of maintain the equivalent of roughly 3 fully loaded reps a month all year round. So if they want to start thinking about, well, we're probably going to let this one person go, et cetera, then they need to start building their ramp model into that. But they know that this particular growth model dictates the need for 3 fully ramped reps. So that's the new business side. Now let's go to the existing business side. By the way, one other thing we do, and I highly encourage you to do, is we use line charts for trailing 12 month versus next 12 months. So once we've built out this model, we want to see, it's basically a sanity check. Does what we're projecting align somewhat reasonably with what our last 12 months experience could be? And this is one of the places, so often boards lay down these, very aggressive goals, and then companies end up building their plans to meet those goals. And then if you look at this, the next 12 months versus the trailing 12 months for any one of these metrics, you go, okay, this is not even possible, right? There's nothing we can do that's going to cause this to have a step function jump like this in the next 30 days. So it's very good sanity check. It's also very good as a tool to help you have these discussions at the very senior leadership level and also with the board. Now, finally, let's get to the existing business side. So here again, the first thing we do is we capture historical monthly revenue by customer. And we encourage all companies to keep one of these files current always. This one goes back like 6 years, where it's actual recognized revenue by customer for every month. And we happen to also identify what month that customer started being a customer in the quarter. And then we also, in this case, happen to identify how they were sourced. And that's because this particular company had fairly different retention dynamics depending on how the prospects or customers were sourced. So I'll show you how that came into play. Anyway, you have your historical revenue in this model. What we then do down here, the section 2 is where we identify the gross revenue retention for each customer in any given month, which is defined as the lower of current revenue or the revenue 12 months ago. By having that along with the actual revenue, what this model produces for you is it does all the retention metrics. So, right, year over year, new logos, churn logos, logo retention, gross dollar retention, net dollar retention, et cetera. Now, what we do for this company, because they did slice these things by sourcing dimension, we actually repeated this process by channel. And what that gave us then is it gave us all the retention metrics by channel. And then you simply take those retention metrics and you apply them against your current customer base based on how they were sourced in this particular company's case. And that'll give you a forward look of how your existing customer base will look in terms of their revenue over the next 12 or 18 months. So we've now done a forward-looking model for new logo, done a forward-looking model, which is easy really for existing business. And then we simply aggregate those together, understand how the revenue recognition works, and that gives us a total recognized revenue projection by month for the next 12 months. So I'm going to go back to here and summarize. Again, what we're trying to help companies do is not have a useless AOP. And so many of them are right out of the gate because they do such a superficial job on the revenue plan. So what we were trying to show you today is what it means to not do a superficial job on the revenue plan or the growth model. if you want to have an AOP with a long shelf life, this work needs to be done. Beyond making a stronger AOP, it ought to also helps to codify assumptions across the team and drive alignment across the team around the initiatives and investments that will most likely drive growth. And one of the benefits, again, of the visual context model is it provides a communications vehicle, particularly for board level discussions, because you can zero in on why you're doing things or where things are not hitting, and having that visual context. And I say this firsthand as a member of boards, makes it much quicker for the board members to sort of understand contextually within your go-to-market engine where stuff is happening. So I'll stop there. Hopefully this has been helpful. Any questions that anybody has, please put them in the chat, and we'll reach out and send you these models in case that would be helpful to you. How does your methodology change when you're dealing with an innovation in business? For example, companies launching a new product that they believe will have improved conversion or retention metrics or new motion. In that case, I think you start with your historical data that was on the previous motion or previous products. And in that growth model assumptions tab, in this section is where you would identify sort of the how you think the conversions might change, and then you document them, right? So the methodology is the same. It relies heavily on you documenting and justifying your assumptions, whether it's around just incremental process improvements through better training or better accountability, or innovation things like a whole new product. I think the modeling process still works the same. I mean, when we've done the Scale Matters, my fifth startup, I mean, when we start companies and have no product, no data, we still build a model because it codifies our assumptions, right? And then it gives us the opportunity very early on to start sort of testing, okay, does this assumption still feel like it's legitimate? All right, great. Well, thank you guys again. Again, have a great weekend, and let us know if we can be helpful.